So the ICJS, for those who may not know, we're an organization that was founded in 1987, and our mission is to build learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. We believe that confronting religious intolerance through education and dialogue is an important part of American life. And we are delighted to have programs that help us understand the complexities of religion in America today. That leads us wonderfully to our guest, Dr. Robert P. Jones, who's the CEO and founder of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute in Washington, D.C. He is a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. Currently, he has 2 books that we've had a chance to talk with him about at ICJS. Last year, The End of White Christian America was the topic of our Mannequin Clark lecture. A video of that lecture is available on our website. And we're delighted to welcome him back today to talk about his most recent book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And we're dropping some links into the chat to purchase the book if you haven't already done so. So I want to slide right into conversation with you, but first ask how you're doing. How's everything going for you in this moment?
Well, you know, I think like many, things are a little heavy and a little hectic. We just started, my son just started school, and my wife, who teaches at GW, just started classes. So we're juggling multiple Zoom links and all today, which we haven't really been doing before. And, you know, and just the events, you know, in Kenosha and other things are, I think, weighing pretty heavily on my minds. I'm sure they are on the minds of many others who are here today.
I'm sure that is certainly the case. And as a good sort of segue into a quote that I want to read, again, at ICJS, we're committed to text study. And so when we have an author on, we want to be able to pull directly from the text. You actually begin your book with a wonderful quote from James Baldwin, who wrote, "I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me and has so impressed me for a very long time as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long." Can you talk about what that quote means to you and why you used it to title your book?
Yeah, well, it's not exactly ending the book on an up note. It's a very challenging quote. I should give some context for it. So it's by James Baldwin. He wrote this just a few months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. So it was a time where he was feeling, and he wrote it in a New York Times op-ed, he was feeling very down and I think very disappointed. And in particular, I think one thing that he and Martin Luther King shared was this sense and this hope that white Americans of goodwill, and particularly white Christians, would ultimately stand up in mass on the side of the civil rights movement. And I think that's, of course, something that never quite really happened. And I think in particular with the assassination of King and Kennedy, he's realizing, you know, that it's not going to happen. And so he's writing from this place of, I think, deep despair and pain there. There's another line after, I'll read just a bit of the fuller quote that comes right after what you read, the part where he says, you know, they've been white, if I may put it, too long. But what follows that is they have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs, and an intolerable violation of myself. So that's the fuller quote from the New York Times op-ed. And you know, I named the book White Too Long because I think that this indictment, you know, that really does come from a deep place of both disappointment, but also love and hope, you know, is one that we're still sitting with, you know, 5-6 decades later. It in many ways could be written today. And so I chose it to kind of, it's the epigraph of the book and the kind of title of the book, because I think it's so important for us to sit in this very uncomfortable place of realizing, I think, particularly for white Christians like myself, of really to, the first chapter of the book is entitled Seeing, SEEING, for a reason. That I think the task before us is first of all to see a more realistic and truer version of our history, and really our role in bringing forth into our present the forces of white supremacy that we're still dealing with today.
One of the things I really appreciated about your book was that you sort of have a memoir aspect of it, that you're struggling with it yourself as you're presenting really important historical facts as well as demographic facts for readers to grapple with. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your personal upbringing and your own relationship to white Christian America.
Yeah, well, if one thrust of the book is for a call to white Christians to tell a truer history of themselves, I didn't think I could do that very well without telling a truer version of mine, right? And to really struggle with that. So, this is not at all a finger-wagging book by an outsider condemning, white Christianity, but it's very much, the first sentence in the book has the word "I" in it. The last sentence in the book has the word "us" in it, and so I see myself. This is very much my own journey on these issues. Just a bit of background. I grew up as a Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi. I was that kid who was at church like 5 days a week growing up. A member of the youth group. Went to a Baptist college. And I have a Master of Divinity degree from a Southern Baptist seminary. And then a PhD in religion from Emory. Also, Methodist affiliated. So, I mean, I've been in this, grew up in this world. I'm very much a product of this world that I'm talking about, and on the inside of this world that I'm talking about. So I think, part of what I tried to make real is my own journey on these issues and growing awareness of these issues, even as I was sort of trying to narrate the history and lay out the current public opinion data and what kind of a witness, that is to where people are today as well.
While white Christian supremacy is a threat to Black and brown Christians, it's also a threat to American religious minorities such as Jews and Muslims. And I know personally, I'm haunted by the videos that came out of Charlottesville, Virginia from 2017, when you have white supremacists defending Confederate statues while screaming, "Jews will not replace us." And similarly, the ongoing efforts of many white Christians to dehumanize Muslims and target Muslim Americans and the religion of Islam in this country. I'm thinking of President Trump's Muslim travel ban and the anti-Sharia legislation that was put forward at various states. So could you talk more specifically about how you understand white Christian America, how white Christian America thinks about Jews and Muslims in this framework?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. It's worth saying that I think, white supremacy in this country has always been tied up with Christian supremacy, and specifically with white Protestant supremacy in the country. It's worth remembering that, with the reincarnation of the kind of rise of the KKK in the early part of the 20th century, I mean, when we say KKK, most people think anti-Black. That's certainly, accurate. But it's worth remembering that the KKK was also anti-Jewish and also anti-Catholic, right? That it was very much a vision of a normative vision of a white Protestant America that was really at the top of the pyramid, and everyone else was below that. And it's, I think sometimes from our current point of view, until we see things like Charlottesville and those chants making this very explicit, it's easy to forget that history. But even a president, as that many would say was progressive, FDR, infamously said, this is a Protestant country, and everyone else is here by sufferance. I mean, that was from a fairly progressive, mid 20th century president. So we're not that far back from these things being said very openly and being asserted in very flat ways. So I think it's always been, tangled up here with this kind of normativity of particularly white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism as what it means. When you say America, that's what that means in that vision of things. And I think part of, the visceral nature of what we're dealing with in the country today, as we talked about with my last book, is that we are at this tipping point in the country where demographically speaking, we are no longer a majority white Christian country. I mean, as recently as 2008, when Barack Obama was first running for president, that would have been true. We were 54% white and Christian. Today, that number is 44. So there's no kind of racial religious majority in the country at this point. And I think part of that shift and that move away from that white Anglo-Saxon, Christian majority is in fact what many are experiencing as a loss, and what many are reacting to, and what many of these fears are being generated around is that loss of white Christian dominance equals the loss of America itself. And there's of course some truth to that if that's the normative view that you had of what America is. So I think re-narrating who we are as a country, as a pluralistic democracy, is one of the most vital things that we have in front of us. But that can't happen unless we finally put an end, I think, to this what's essentially a white Christian nationalist view of who we are.
So I want to pull out a term that you used and just sort of lift it up quickly, which is thinking about white supremacy and Christian supremacy. I think that is a helpful framing for that. I know the first time I encountered that framing was with Janine Hill Fletcher from Fordham, who really sort of argues forcefully that understanding racism and understanding religious intolerance are actions and works and ways of being that require engagement with each other. And then I think specifically, and you reference Willie James Jennings in your book as well, that he sort of does a wonderful job in the Christian imagination, theology, and the origins of race, of sort of narrating how racial thinking gets sort of embedded in this sort of supersessionist or Christian supremacist framework. And so you have to really grapple not only with the sins of slavery itself and racism itself, but also the theologies that support that, which is a really important part of our work at ICJS. So on that note, I want to kind of bring us to chapter 3 of your book. You talked about how chapter 1 was seeing. Chapter 3 is the believing chapter. And you really kind of dive into the theologies of white supremacy. And you break it down into 3 parts. And I'm gonna read a longer quote, and I think we'll throw it in the chat for folks to follow along. It's from page 97. Spelled out, free will individualism means that for white evangelicals, individuals exist independent of structures and institutions. They have free will and are individually accountable for their own actions. Relationalism means that white evangelicals tend to see the root of all problems in poor relationships between individuals rather than unfair laws or institutional behavior. And finally, anti-structuralism denotes the deep suspicion with which white evangelicals view institutional explanations for social problems, principally because they believe invoking social structures shift blame for where it belongs with sinful individuals. I think highlighting those three aspects, free will individualism, relationalism, and anti-structuralism, are just so critical to your book. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about those belief structures.
Yeah, well, let me first pay my debts here. I owe great debt to Michael Emerson and his earlier work on race and evangelicals, in particular in his great book, Divided by Faith. And really these categories are teased out of that early work about 15 years ago, but they continue to resonate today, and I think to be in many ways the Rosetta Stone for understanding just the ways in which everything from the way that salvation is thought of, the way that a personal relationship with Jesus is made central, that all of these are about a kind of individualistic way of understanding religion, so that if religion becomes about a very interior, individualized relationship with God through Jesus and the Christian formulation, what that screens out really is the power of institutions and structures. And we really see the power of that. And so, just to make this really personal, how was it that I went to church every week, multiple times a week, my entire life? And I can honestly say, never once in the Southern Baptist churches that I that I grew up in did I hear a sermon about civil rights or racial injustice. Not once. So how is that, right? And I grew up in Mississippi, where these inequalities were really front and center and pretty rife. And I think that's a testimony to the power of this theological worldview. And what it does, it creates a kind of blinders to institutional injustice and structural racism, so that you can sort of, at the same time, all this is swirling around you. You can, if you have this sense that your own individual relationship with Jesus as an interior, emotional, psychological experience is intact, the rest of it ceases really to matter. And Martin Luther King actually saw this quite clearly. The other kind of text that has really stayed with me is Letter from Birmingham Jail, which I think, again, we could read today, and it's just as relevant as it was when it was written in 1963. But there he has this phrase, this haunting phrase, where he's not writing to the extremists. He's not writing to the KKK or to the more extreme segregationists. He's writing in that letter to the mainstream Jewish and Christian leaders in Birmingham, right? These aren't the extremists. These are the so-called racial moderate religious leaders. And he's in dismay, right? He says, who are these people? These tall steeples and these grand institutions, but utterly inactive, and silent on the great issues of the day. And this phrase he has, sitting behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows, right? And the sense that the role that the theology and the institutions played was actually lulling white Christian consciences to sleep, and putting moral blinders on them. And I think that's still such an issue today, because we have, while I think saying some of the outright segregationist things that someone could say freely in 1960, isn't tolerated in white Christian churches today, the theology that supported those things has hardly been reformed. And I think that's one of the big tasks in front of us today.
I want to lift up your image and go a little farther with these stained glass windows in particular, and also to own my own identity and my own place in this story. I'm a white Roman Catholic woman, in all and with all that brings. So who went to Catholic school her whole life through undergrad, and is still a committed Catholic, raising Catholic kids. One of the things that really struck me was the role that white Christian women in particular played in creating stained glass windows, as you so nicely highlighted. And you do a nice job of sort of narrating the extensive and incredibly impactful role that white Christian women played in the creation of not only sort of physical structures, but really the liturgies of sort of white Christian supremacy, and the sort of theological underpinnings and rituals of the lost cause. And so I was really just wondering if you could reflect on both the United Daughters of the Confederacy, but also the particular role that white Christian women are playing in our contemporary conversation of race in America.
Yeah, the United Daughters of the Confederacy was not a group I knew about really before I started doing research for the book, which is quite extraordinary, given I've got a PhD in religion and had never heard of this group. They operated very much in tandem with Christian churches, but they were in their heyday at the late 1800s and turn of the century, early 1900s. I mean, they were 100,000 women strong, and these were women who were dedicated to upholding the values of the Confederacy and transmitting them to the next generation. So even though the South had lost the war, slavery had been abolished, they were very much dedicated to promoting that worldview, right? That kind of white supremacist worldview that the Confederate states were out to defend, and holding that up as a valorous cause. So everything from the statues that we've seen in Richmond, that have, many of which have been pulled down just in the last weeks over the summer. Those were put up by the UDC. The original Confederate battle flag was sewn by UDC women sitting in Episcopalian churches. The first Confederate battle flag used in Georgia was sewn in a Baptist church in Georgia by Baptist women. And the monuments that we see throughout the country, right now, like 1,700 of these Confederate monuments to the Confederacy on public lands, the vast majority of those were funded by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So I think there's this great, like, really unknown history there, and they were largely connected, I think, through to money. They were from the kind of wealthy class and connected to the most prominent churches, you know, in the country as well. And you mentioned the catechism. I mean, even not just statues, but actually created a Confederate catechism to go along with the Christian catechism. It was actually formed, and if you know a catechism, it looks and reads very much the same way. Instead of saying, you know, the first question being who is God, and having a rote answer that children are supposed to memorize, you know, the first answer is what was the cause of the war between the states, and there's a rote answer that the children are supposed to memorize, and very much the same way. So, I mean, the one thing I'd point to in the modern sense is our the great emptying of the public school system, and much of that was, I think, orchestrated by white Christian women as well. This kind of exodus and the creation of Christian academies across, you know, really across the South in particular in the 70s. Another place, I think, where the role of white Christian women in education has been really underplayed and underappreciated, I think.
I kind of want to talk about something that I like to call the good religion, bad religion trap, and you also reference it as well. And again, sort of taking the confessional stance, right? I'm still a Christian. I still claim that identity. I still want to be a Christian. And I think there's a lovely quote that you have from page 75 and bleeds over into 76, that while white Christianity was protecting the interests and consciences of those under its canopy, white Christians were also staunchly defending the purity and innocence of the religion itself. They accomplished this principally by projecting an idealized form of white Christianity as somehow independent of the failings of actual white Christians or institutions. The mythology, really the lie that white Christians tell ourselves on the few occasions we face our history, is that Christianity has been a force for unambiguous good in the world. No matter what evil Christians commit or what violence Christian institutions justify, an idealized conception of Christianity remains unscathed. This conviction is so deep that evidence to the contrary is simply dismissed. That's a bold claim all the way around. And I was wondering how, on this book tour, white Christians have responded to your claim and really responded to the claim that, you know, there's a lot of things about Christianity and white Christianity that are not so good, that are in fact things that we need to work on.
Well, it's been a mixed bag. I'm happy to say, actually, that it's been a mixed bag. I mean, there's certainly, you know, that's a hard thing to face, I think. But I do think there has been the biggest problem, our barrier for having an honest conversation, I think, among white Christian churches is this insistence on a kind of purity and innocence of our own history, right? And to me, that's a sort of immature way of thinking about one's faith and one's history. And you know, what I've been really calling on is for white Christians to kind of grow up, right, and to be able to accept this more complex history. That yes, there's a lot of good. I mean, in my own story, I could say, look, I would not be who I was, who I am, who I've become without the good things that my white Christian church poured into me growing up. At the same time, I inherited these moral blinders we were talking about, you know, something for which I'm not grateful for. I've had to work really hard to kind of get around, and even still know that they probably are working on me in ways that I'm not really even conscious of. That's a really difficult thing to hold at the same time, but I think it is the more mature way to think about one's faith, and particularly if you think you know, seriously about, you know, we don't receive our faith, you know, from on high. I mean, we receive it from human hands, right? And it's handed down from generation to generation, and it is the job of every generation, I think, to critically take what has been handed to one and examine it and decide, is this the thing I want to hand to my kids and my grandchildren, right? We're part of a great chain of being. Each of us has our own responsibility to see with the eyes that we have in the time that we have. And there's certainly things, I think, now that we can see that were much more difficult for previous generations to see. And so it's our job, really our responsibility to assume that mantle, take responsibility, and step it forward. Now, there's certainly people who aren't willing to do that and are going to die on the hill that, there's a pure form of the church that somehow is living on earth. But I think the bulk of us, if we are just take long enough to kind of get past our initial defensiveness, know that that's not true. And in fact, if we think about it long enough, we have a lot at stake. I think, forget about like what we might owe African Americans and indigenous people in the country due to this history. But if we really care about the integrity of our own religion, we have a lot at stake. In fact, I took a little bit of flack for this in the book. I actually argue that we have more at stake because it's we who have actually been disfigured by this commitment. It's our faith, it's our religious tradition that's been disfigured by this commitment to white supremacy, and it's our job to really, to best we can, to set that right.
I want to push on this topic a little bit more with an interreligious lens. I think one of the things we've learned at ICJS, and I know I've experienced on various panels, is how the good religion, bad religion travel interreligiously. So folks will sort of lift up the ideals of their tradition and then look at the worst practices of a religious other. I think that Leonard Swidler sort of famously lifted up in his principles the one that one must only compare his ideals with the partner's ideals and his practices with the partner's practices, not your ideals with your other partner's practice. Yeah. And that has sort of become a mantra in interfaith and interreligious work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how good religion, bad religion plays into white Christian America with religious others. I think PRRI has some interesting data about views on Christian violence and Muslim violence, if I remember.
Yeah. So there's been this great double standard exactly along these lines, right? That I think one of the things we've seen in just the use of the word terrorism, all right, for example, right, that in the U.S. context, various politicians and certainly President Trump has been very quick to use radical Islamic terrorists, right? That word came out of his mouth a ton in the 2016 convention, for example, but there's been a lot of reluctance to use the word Christian terrorists, in this context, even though, like, for example, the FBI's data shows there's been many more people killed over the last few years by far right, white terrorists, many of whom are identified as Christian. Those are the facts on the ground, but we don't talk about it that way. So we had a survey question where we asked people in a kind of a split sample experiment, and we asked basically, look, when someone who identifies as Christian commits acts of violence in the name of Christianity, do you believe they're really Christian or not? And then the other half of the sample we asked about Islam, and we said, someone who is Muslim or commits acts of violence in the name of Islam, do you think they're really Muslim or not? And we saw this great double standard that people are much more willing to say, oh yes, that person's really Muslim, than they are to say, oh yes, that person's really Christian. And what that really shows is that there is this kind of false idealized or fictional idealized version of Christianity that many people just hold as a positive view, no matter what actual Christians do on the ground. I think this fits into my previous comments that, one, that's just not fair on the interreligious piece of this, that certainly we have to pick a metric stick and use the same one if we're really going to have an honest conversation. But then I think the other thing to say is that we're really doing damage to ourselves if we can't face these elements within our own faith, right? And to protect something, and to pretend, for example, that when Ross Barnett in 1960 said that God was the original segregationist, right? While he was the superintendent of the men's Sunday school program at First Baptist Church in Jackson, my hometown, like, we've got to call that, as hard as this may be, I think the more honest thing to say is that, like, that's a version of Christianity, right? It's not inauthentic Christianity. That was the Christianity that people at First Baptist Church at that time endorsed. And if we take that seriously, I think that puts more front and center the real work to be done, rather than pretending that that was some falling away of some idealized thing that we've never actually seen on the ground, but to say, look, the real lived version of Christianity that we saw, that was authentic. And as far as the people who were following it could see, I mean, the people of First Baptist Church gave Ross Barnett a big pulpit Bible and sent him on his way after running a segregationist campaign, as you know, sent him on his way with a Christian service honoring his place in his inauguration as governor, and saw absolutely no conflict in that. And so I think we got to take that seriously, and it just means that we've got work to do, because that has absolutely survived and is still with us today.
Yeah, I think the call that you're making to do that hard work, to do that sort of self-reflection, to engage in education, to engage in dialogue is just critical if we're going to move forward as a country and as an interreligious, interracial country specifically. I want to kind of shift, because we're having this conversation just at the close of the Democratic and Republican national conventions, which because of COVID-19 really lived in television in a really new way. And as a leading commentator on religion and politics, how do you see white Christian America playing into both the Democratic and Republican conventions that we just saw in the last few weeks?
Yeah, you know, one of the, I think, unfortunate things about our history today is that our two parties are more, we have a two-party system. It is more polarized than we've ever seen, pretty much any way you want to measure it. And that one of the things that has led to this polarization has absolutely to do with race and religion. So today, for example, the Republican Party is about 2/3 white and Christian. The Democratic Party is about 1/3 white and Christian. Most Christians of color are in the Democratic Party, right? Most white Christians are in the Republican Party. Now, what this means is that we've got partisanship, racial identity, and religious identity all melded together, right, in this very powerful way, which I think is lending itself to this visceral nature in our that we're seeing in our politics. But I think we also have to again take an honest look at how we got here, and the historical record points to the biggest through line is that the beginnings of our current political parties stem directly from the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s. Prior to 1965, we would talk about, we political scientists, we'd be talking about the solid Democratic South with most white Christians in the Democratic Party. But what led to the sea change really was the Democratic Party becoming associated as the party of civil rights. And as soon as that happens and gets solidified, you have this white Christian flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party that really gets solidified by the time you get to Reagan. And if someone were to say, hey, how can you describe the religious landscape over the last few decades in terms of voting? It'd be no oversimplification to say, well, look, what the pattern basically is white Christians vote for Republican and majorities for Republican candidates, and everyone else, Christians of color, non-Christian religious Americans, and religiously unaffiliated Americans vote for Democratic presidential candidates and majorities. And so it's no surprise that the issues of race and racial justice have become, the dividing lines, between our two political parties. And I think that's what we're really seeing today.
So I want to shift at this point, just recognizing the time to audience questions. I think folks have been putting questions in the Q&A part of the chat. Please continue to do so. Continue to upvote questions that you find relevant. I'm going to pull some, thanks to my colleagues for helping to organize a few of these questions. So I have a question that says, from Mary Brock, can you comment on white Christian churches' acceptance, rejection, discomfort with Black Christian churches, or sort of talk more about the relationship between white Christian churches and Black Christian churches?
Yeah. Well, still today, this thing that Martin Luther King was famous for saying, that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of American life, is still largely true. Only about 15% of churches today are multiracial churches, and denominations are still largely segregated along racial lines, so much so that, for example, when political scientists or social scientists are sorting religious groups in public opinion polls like we do, we sort them by both race and religion. That it's just that clear. So I think there's a great deal of segregation there. one of the things that we're seeing, in the last 5 years, as these kind of racial justice issues have come to the fore, is that there were some efforts made to kind of bring white and Black Christian churches together that have been much more difficult in the last 5 years. That and many African Americans who had been working inside of white evangelical churches have simply left. As these issues have become just more daunting over the last few years. So I think we're at a place where those efforts have never been more important and never more difficult.
Does PRRI have any data around multiracial churches that would be illuminating for our conversation today?
A bit, yeah. And Hartford Seminary has done a great deal of work on this as well. But the numbers really are that only about 15% of the churches are multiracial churches. Many of them are actually newer churches that kind of started that way. I know that one of the big key things for the survival of those churches as multiracial churches, and not just ending up evolving into one or the other, is leadership, right? That you have to have senior leadership from the group that is not the dominant group, right? And if you don't have that, over time, what tends to happen is they tend to thin out with the majority group kind of being the one that ends up being even more the majority down the line. So I think those kind of commitment to leadership at the top of things, but there's very few blueprints for this, just because it's such a rarity in American public life today.
Here's a question from Stephen Shore. Lincoln noted in his second inaugural address that both sides pray to the same God. How do we move towards greater integrity without anointing one side as the party of God? That's a great question. Yeah,
no, Lincoln I think about this a lot, actually. It's a great point. And it's a humility, right? Is really what you see in Lincoln's writing there, that even, I think the temptation, and he was getting pushed actually, for that address to declare, the kind of God on the side of abolition, right? Which would have been, maybe the easier claim to make. I mean, he has some kind of feints toward that in the second inaugural, but ultimately he takes this question like, look, I want to validate that there was at least some sincerity, even if it may have been misguided, some sincerity on both sides. That was a way, I think, of granting some dignity there. But at the same time, I think, calling out slavery as an injustice, I think that's the trick. That on the one hand, I think acknowledging sincerity, but on the other hand, having to figure out, on the issues of racial injustice, I think we can't really equivocate on those issues. We have to be willing. Frederick Douglass, after the Civil War, for example, was just distraught that at the kind of valorization of the South and the valorization of Robert E. Lee and others, as if there were, just because there was a great struggle, that the two sides were equivalent, right? He said, look, these weren't equivalent sides. One was defending, slavery. The other one was struggling against it. So it's challenging. I think on the one hand, we can't claim God on our side. On the other hand, I think we have to call out injustice as best we can and do it as clearly as we can.
I think I have two questions from Darla and Chris O'Keefe about white Catholics and the role of Catholics in your book. We haven't really talked about that too much. So could you please talk a little bit about the role or the relationship between white evangelicals and Catholics, or just more about Catholicism and the role of Catholics and Catholic institutions in your research?
Yeah, I'll do that with some trepidation with Heather sitting here staring at me. But who knows the history much better than I do. But I was actually, it's one of the places where I learned the most, actually, in doing the historical work, because Catholics obviously have a very complex history of their own in terms of facing discrimination in this country. There was even well into the 20th century, a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, and even at JFK's, the question he kept getting asked over and over and over in the campaign was, isn't there just going to be a hotline to the Pope? And, are you really going to be able to be the president and loyal to America? Like those kinds of questions over and over. So that was with us, quite late. But one of the things that I became clear about is that, this thread and this commitment to white supremacy, and here Willie James Jennings' book was helpful too, right? It comes into Catholicism really through the colonial commitments, right? Everything from the doctrine of discovery in 1493, which basically justified claiming any lands that weren't, occupied by Christians. That mostly meant brown and black people around the world. That justified, that kind of land seizure, and that comes through. And then even in the American context, seeing things like in the late 18th century in Maryland, the state in which I live now, that a significant number, about a fifth of Catholics in the late 1700s in Maryland were enslaved people owned by Catholic institutions or wealthy Catholics. So that weren't at all immune to this. And even in the North, there were practices of, keeping parishes segregated, and even where African Americans were allowed into Catholic worship services, were made to receive the Eucharist last after all the white people, all whites had received the Eucharist. St. Mark's Parish in New York was the designated parish where all African Americans had to attend school if they wanted to go to Catholic school, whereas whites all over the city could go to their local parish school. So very intentional segregation. And then, like people like W. Du Bois actually called the Catholic Church the most racist religious institution in the country. When he was looking out and looking at things. So I think the history, even though it's not Southern history, I think that's the thing, that it was, more urban, more Northeast, and yet you still see, these kind of commitments to white supremacy coming through. And even in the current public opinion data, which we haven't talked about a lot here, but in the current public opinion data, white Catholics are right there with white evangelicals and white mainline Protestants in their scores on questions around systemic racism, just as nearly as likely as white evangelicals to deny its existence.
I have another question. The Catholic questions are really, they're coming fast and furious right now. Just take a second to look at them. So I think one of the questions, and this relates, I think, to more contemporary understanding of white Christian America and the incorporation of white Catholics. How do you factor in the abortion issue on the sort of vision of white Christian America?
Yeah. Well, the one more point I want to make about Catholics also is to remember, because I think it's really helpful in understanding whiteness, that sort of in the 19th century, not only were Catholics not considered to be properly Christian from a Protestant point of view, but many were also not considered to be white, right? Italians, for example, were not classified as white. Irish people were not classified as white. They were, even on the official census forms, if you were Irish, you had to check Celt. You couldn't check Caucasian, right, on there. And if you look at like political cartoons and other kinds of cultural cartoons from that era, Catholics are always pictured as more dark-skinned. That there was a kind of a racialization of Irish and Italian folks to kind of differentiate them from more light-skinned Protestants. Even in the kind of cultural, artwork that we can see from the time. But here's the other thing that I think I became fairly clear about is that one of the things that happened as African Americans were fleeing the South during the Great Migration, they were settling in places like Chicago and New York that already had well-established Catholic neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods, and many times were in conflict because they were pushing people out of those ethnic neighborhoods. But at the time, by that time, many Catholics had found enough upward mobility that they could afford to move out to the suburbs, right? And so you had an influx of African Americans and a sort of moving out of many Catholics out of ethnic neighborhoods into the suburbs. And one of the things that happened, I think, in that move is that as Italians or Irish Catholics moved out of their old ethnic neighborhoods where that country of origin ethnicity was important, and they landed in the suburbs, they found that they could simply be white. along with everyone else out in the suburbs. So whiteness, I think, became more salient for Catholics as they sort of moved more middle class and moved more into the suburbs. And I think in particular in the late, and this kind of gets me to the abortion issue, in the late 20th century, this expansion of the kind of Christian right movement to be a cooperative movement between Catholics and Protestants would have been unheard of 50 years prior to that. But part of that was kind of finding political cause together, and that reinforced, I think, the sort of white Christian identity wrapped into a kind of Republican partisanship as well. Abortion is a sort of complicated issue. On the one hand, it does mark certainly white evangelicals more than it marks any other group. What's often not known is that most Catholics actually support the legalization of abortion. They don't look that much different than the general population on the issue, as do majorities of white mainline Protestants. There's really only white evangelicals who oppose the legality of abortion, and even there, it's less than 3 in 10 that say it should be completely abolished. The other thing to say is that in 10 years of doing public opinion surveys, despite all the public rhetoric, I have never seen a public opinion survey come back and say that the issue of abortion is even among the top 3 or 4 issues among any white Christian group, right? It's all terrorism, jobs, healthcare, other things always outpace that issue. And even when we've asked people very specifically about whether whether you would withhold your vote from an elected leader who doesn't share your position on abortion, it turns out that not as many Americans as you think use that as a litmus test issue. So even when we ask them directly, and even if you're looking at, for example, white evangelicals or white Catholics who oppose abortion, it's still only about 3 in 10 who tell us that that issue is a deal breaker for them in terms of their vote.
I would want to parse what you said just a little bit further, because I think what you're saying is really, really interesting. I'm hearing you highlight kind of 3 distinct audiences and also 3 distinct arenas for data or for information. One, I think your research has demonstrated what do people who identify as religious say, and what do they actually do, and what do they believe when they're kind of filling out a survey. And so kind of it's a snapshot of people in the pews, how they're thinking. I think there's another layer, which is sort of, again, official church teaching around abortion, and what is the position of the church on this issue is very, very clear. And in opposition, actually, that tension that you're highlighting is a really interesting one between what is official church teaching and then how do people actually understand and prioritize that. So I would sort of say you have the people in the pews, you've got the church teaching, and then you've got this sort of media narrative around abortion and the role that abortion plays in both political understandings and in belief structures. And I feel like we haven't really talked about the media piece in this, sort of role of that. I don't know if you would want to go further on this topic or just kind of step back to the 30,000 foot level about what do you think about the way religion is covered in the media in the US at this moment?
Yeah, well, one of the things I've been trying to draw attention to is actually that the media is a little bit obsessed with white evangelicals. I think we all understand why that is. I mean, they are the group that voted 81% for Donald Trump. They're the kind of core group of the Republican Party. They make up more than 1/3 of the Republican Party today. So it makes sense. But that's not where the election's really going to get decided. That group is pretty locked in. We have yet to see any kind of movement away from the president, even as we've been tracking it as recently as last month. But where there is volatility, and both in favorability and on some of these issues around racial justice, is among white Catholics and white mainline Protestants. That we're seeing, for example, white Catholic favorability for Donald Trump is down below 40%. He's underwater with white Catholics right now in terms of favorability, and among white mainliners, it's a little underwater too, more divided than that. But white evangelicals are the only ones that are strongly supporting him. And the reason why this really matters, at least in terms of election politics, is that if you look at the states where it's really going to, the election's really going to be decided, it's not the deep South states that have so many white evangelicals in them. I mean, those states are pretty much locked in, they're red states. but where the election is really going to be decided is the upper Midwest, right? So it's Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. In those 3 states, for example, Trump only won the popular vote by 78,000 votes in all 3 of those states combined. In Michigan, it was only 10,000 votes. And what's important is that in those states also, white mainline Protestants and white Catholics are as big or bigger than white evangelicals, right? So where is it really going to get decided? In those upper Midwest states, and really the votes that are really going to matter, I think, in the religious landscape are what happens with the white Catholic vote and what happens with the white mainline Protestant vote. I mean, again, those groups are as big or bigger than the evangelicals in these states that matter. It's also the wild card, is that Joe Biden is himself a white Catholic, and how that will play, in the election. I think it could go. There's ways of thinking it could go both ways, but it looks like so far he's well ahead of Trump in favorability among white Catholics today.
So it looks like we have a time for just a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. I'm going to combine these questions together, but they are distinct questions. One, white Christians seem to be the intended audience for your book. What do you have to say to Black, Indigenous, people of color individuals who have been hurt by white supremacy embedded within white Christianity?
Yeah. Well, I actually think the book is written for, a broad audience. I mean, it is a book that's deeply personal. And so I think therefore focused and written, I think, from the inside out. As a white Christian and social scientist, I'm writing very clearly from my own perspective. But I think the book really is about how we got to where we are. And so for anyone who really wants to understand, I think the political divisions, the racial divisions that we're seeing play out on a daily basis, understanding this history, I think, of how we got to this place is I think really clear and really important, just for understanding where we are and therefore understanding how we might get anywhere else, on these issues. And remind, the second part was what again?
The second part, I actually didn't say it out at the beginning, which was
okay.
What would you say what resources would you recommend to white religious communities who want to confront their whiteness? So
yeah,
I felt like I was relating them into sort of to your audience question. What are you saying to white Christians? What are you saying to Black, Indigenous people of color?
Yeah, I will say when I've talked to African-American ministers and the correspondence I've had, there's actually been a great deal of interest from those organizations as well. Mm-hmm. So I think I've been really happy to see that. The one thing I'd point to is actually the New Yorker has a piece out today that has like 5 different resources. I'm happy to say White Too Long is among those resources. But there's I think it's called American Christianity's White Supremacy Problem is the title of the article by Michael Luo. But it lays out like a number of resources from Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise to a number of others that I think are like, I think like diving in, but I think, doing it in community is really important. One of the things like I learned just from my own thing here, and just my dialogue with my own parents around this book. I learned things from conversations that were started by what I was writing that I would not have known, and in some cases I might have never known had we not just initiated these conversations. And so I think having something like to read that kind of kicks the conversation off, creates a space, but then I think telling our own stories and trying to tell the truth about our own stories, I think is really important. And for white Christian churches, I think like one question that I think often will get you very quickly into a question about race and racial justice and segregation and all of that is to just ask the question, why is your church geographically located where it is? Yeah. And if we sit with that question long enough, if your church is in the suburbs, why is it there? If your church is in the city, who does it serve? Is it sitting in a very diverse neighborhood but entirely white because everybody commutes in from the suburbs, and what does that mean? I think having this, because it's so wrapped up with geography and zoning and all of that stuff, I think just that conversation, just that one question should generate a fair amount of serious reflection.
I think one more question and then we'll wrap up. a question is coming in about the racism index, and I think this was also one of the really important takeaways from your book, which is that the strength of Christian belief and attendance at church actually relates to an increase in racist thoughts and sort of opinions. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. And specifically, the questioner wants to know, have you received any pushback regarding your research and the creation of the racism index? So,
well, that's easy. Yes. You know, it's a sort of difficult thing to face, I think. So I'll try to do it as concisely as I can. So one of the things I wanted to do is to try to measure, you know, people holding racist attitudes. And particularly, I wasn't so interested in personal ill feelings towards someone of a different race. I was more interested in the structural, systemic questions. So we used a set of questions, a set of 15 different questions that covered everything from killing of African-American men by police and criminal justice and the kind of unequal treatment in the criminal justice system, Confederate monuments, Confederate flags, economic mobility and limits to economic mobility among African-Americans due to past discrimination, and a range of other questions. So there are 15 questions like that. And then we kind of scored them all in the same direction and then scaled it all together on a scale of 1 to 10. So that if you scored 10, that meant you answered kind of the most, had the most, kind of holding the most racist attitudes. If you answered 1, it was holding the least racist attitudes. And what we found was in doing that analysis that white Christians of all kinds were about twice as likely as whites who were not religiously affiliated to score higher on that scale. So for example, white evangelicals scored 8 out of 10 on this racism index, but white Catholics and white mainline Protestants were right behind them at 7 out of 10. And compare that to white unaffiliated Americans who only scored 4 out of 10. African Americans are down at 2 out of 10, right? So you kind of see just in this pattern that, you know, this counterintuitive, if you come out of the Christian tradition, you'd think that Christianity would make you closer to the attitudes of our African American brothers and sisters. But in fact, white Christian identity tends to move people further away there. And those whites who aren't affiliated are actually closer to African American views on these issues. And I tested it also for all kinds of intervening variables that could possibly explain it. Being Republican, living in the South, education levels, gender, you know, you name it, urban versus rural. And even with all those controls in place, this relationship between holding more racist attitudes and white Christian identification holds up. And then that takes us to the church thing. The other objection will be, well, you know, maybe these people are just Christian in name only, right? That they're not really connected to a church. They haven't really been discipled or formed in any serious way. So, but even when I looked at attendance, at best, we found among white Christians overall that attendance made no difference in this relationship between holding racist attitudes and white Christian identity. And very particularly among white evangelical Protestants, the group in which I grew up, the relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as a white evangelical was actually stronger among those who attended church more often, right? So in fact, it made it worse. Attending church more often actually made it worse among white evangelicals. So it's a very robust and really unsettling, you know, set of conclusions here. And then in particular, this idea that if you take your average white person and you add Christianity, they become more racist, is what this, you know, if you really boil it down, compared to those who are not Christian.
I think one of the things I really appreciated about the way you concluded your book was focusing on that white Christians can't sort of rush to forgiveness. We can't sort of seek a repentance model for this, that we really need to reckon. And I'm just so grateful for this book and for your conversation here today, because I think you've given us all a lot to really reckon with and to begin our educational journeys. So thank you for being with us today. I just want to talk to the audience briefly. We're going to invite you to join any of our upcoming events, most of which are going to be online this fall. You can go to our homepage, which is ICJS.org, to find out more. Specifically, we're going to have a meet and greet conversation with our new Muslim scholar, Dr. Zainab Salegan, on September 15th at 4 o'clock. And we're also going to be launching a series of interfaith dialogue videos and conversations around interreligious conceptions of water justice in the Imagining Justice in Baltimore series. So please sign up for those. And finally, if you liked this program and this conversation and you want to promote interreligious understanding in America at this moment, I hope that you'll donate to the ICJS today. The link is going to be dropped in the chat. We're an independent academic nonprofit, and we rely on individuals and foundations for support for our work. So help keep this type of programming happening and available in Baltimore and now online. So Robbie, thank you so much for joining us today and for talking with us and for the good work that you're doing and the amazing research that you're providing. So
Oh, thanks, Heather. I was really happy to be here.
All right. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your evening. Be well.